Hey everybody, Brian here. Today I'm going to talk about a super useful and super long-awaited feature in Final Cut Pro called magnetic masks. Now this is a technology that's been around for a while, which you might know of as auto rotoscoping. So this isn't any kind of new technological breakthrough. This has been around in Adobe After Effects, for instance, but now we finally have that in Final Cut Pro. So let's unmask this new feature. Okay, here we are in Final Cut Pro 11, and what I have here are several clips that show different types of subjects under different types of conditions, and some of those conditions are pretty tricky for this kind of masking. So collectively, these should give us a good indication of how well a magnetic mask performs, not just under ideal types of scenarios, but under some pretty challenging ones as well. Okay, nothing as challenging as climbing K2, but you know. First clip is on the ocean side. There's a beautiful woman there. Oops, I said beautiful woman. I guess that means I'm a toxic male or something, right? Anyway, that's my wife. I don't think she minds me calling her beautiful. We took a trip to the US recently, spent a couple of weeks on the New England coast. For instance, this one's at Rye in New Hampshire. Before you get really deep into the comparisons with After Effects, Roto Brush, and magnetic mask, let's just get into the interface, how to use magnetic mask. There are a couple of ways to add the mask. One way is to just go to the effects browser under masks and keying and just drag the mask onto a clip, at which point you're going to be greeted by this really weird user interface. Especially for 2024, you'd think they'd do a little bit better. It's almost like they use ChatGPT with a prompt, create a user interface for Final Cut Pro. And then they didn't bother to check, did it produce garbage? And that's what we're left with. You actually have to look really close to see that there's something in these seemingly black boxes. Arrows and stuff. Basically, it's a strange visual cue telling you have to take some action before you see what's revealed. For instance, you see this eyedropper tool when you first add the mask, that's telling you to click on the subject somewhere so that it knows what should be masked. And now you see these dark boxes have been illuminated, telling you what they're used for. I'll show you a second way, which is to go to this Enhancements tool drop-down, choose Add Magnetic Mask, and that's identical to the first way that I just showed you. And then a third way is just to drag the magnetic mask right onto the subject in the preview window. And I'll use the first method. I'm just going to drag the mask right onto the clip. And the first thing you want to do is add a control point. That's automatically lit up, this tool right here, circle with a plus sign. So you choose somewhere on the subject. And it's not going to create an ideal mask right off the bat. You have to do some work. So here I see I need to add some additional control points. For instance, in the hair on the subject, foot, and some other places. Notice how when you add control points in one place, sometimes you see effects in a completely other part of the subject or in the background. So it's kind of counterintuitive. You would think control points work locally, but they can have an effect anywhere on the subject. And now after you've added enough control points, you're going to notice that there's some touch-up work to be done. Now I'm going to choose the negative control point tool. That's this circle with a minus sign in it. Now I'm just going to click where there should not be any masking. Okay, so now I have a pretty good mask, and you can see that there's a lot of gamesmanship involved here. You're playing this really weird game with these control points, using the positive and the negative points to create a pretty good mask. And then once you've done that, you can further refine with these brush tools. So now we'll talk about those. First I'll click a positive brush, and you can adjust the size, and then just add into the mask anywhere you think should be included. So that's pretty intuitive. Likewise with the negative brush. So you get the idea. You use the control points to create a good initial mask, and then you use the brushes to fine-tune that. The goal is to have a reference frame that's going to be used for the analysis. You want that reference frame to be as accurate as possible. Now notice we still have these dark boxes here on the top. Those have to do with the reference frames that have already been added. So down in the clip under a magnetic mask, you'll see this yellow circle. Those yellow circles indicate your reference frames. So I have one reference frame right now. If I go ahead in time, notice how we see a left arrow. That allows you to browse backwards through the reference frames that you have. So if I click there, it goes to the initial reference frame I added. But it doesn't show me a right arrow because I haven't added anything to the right of this. So let's just say I added another reference frame here. So I'll click to add a control point. And now from this new reference frame, I can go backwards. And from this one, I can go forward. You're probably wondering, what do you have to do to see both arrows? And you probably already guessed. You have to be somewhere where you're between reference frames. So let's add another one here. Okay, so now we see almost all the boxes are revealing their functions, except one. We'll talk about that in a little while. That has to do with using multiple masks on one clip. Now at this point you're probably thinking, oh, that's cool. I can do the analysis from one reference frame to the next, just press a button. Well, it doesn't actually work that way. You're limited in the ways you can analyze. You could click the analyze button and that's going to analyze the entire clip. You could click these two arrows. You would think that would analyze one frame ahead, but that's actually going to analyze from the current playhead position all the way to the end. And then it turns out this arrow here is what would do an analysis one frame ahead. So I think Apple kind of reversed that. I think most people would expect this button here would move one frame ahead and this one would move to the end, but it's the opposite. So for instance, I'll click here and you can see it moving ahead. And it's kind of hard to see, but if I zoom in, notice some area has been filled in white, telling you which frames have been analyzed. And then if you press this button here, it'll analyze to the very end. And you can stop it anywhere you want. I'm not going to do the analysis yet. And then likewise with these buttons, these two arrows will analyze all the way to the very first frame of the clip. And this one would analyze one frame backwards. So there you saw some additional frames light up here, indicating they've been analyzed. And then I can analyze to the very beginning, and you can stop anywhere you want. So that's a way to iteratively go through this entire process. Let me just undo what I've done there. Or you could just do a one-click solve, and I think a lot of users are going to be interested in that kind of feature. And in that case, you would choose some reference frame, and then press Analyze. So now let's just go ahead and do an analysis. I know this mask doesn't look ideal, but I just want to show you quickly how this is done. And I'm going to cut this just to make it quicker. So when you press Analyze, it'll go from the current playhead position to the end of the clip, and then it'll go back to that playhead position, and then go to the beginning of the clip, like so. I'm sure you don't want to be in suspense any longer about this black box here. That has to do with multiple masks. So this symbol here, the upper body with a plus sign to the right, that's for adding an additional mask. So now say I wanted to add sand, and there we have it. A second mask has been added. And now you see this little symbol here, allowing you to toggle between the current mask visibility as well as seeing all masks. So we've done an analysis, and one thing you can do is apply feathering, and that's accessed in the video inspector. So positive feathering will expand the mask area, and then negative feathering will contract it. Also, this little upper body symbol here, this is the toggle of seeing the subject masked with the background. You can also click here, and then you'll see the background removed. So that's what that's all about. You also see this view masks. So if you click that, now you're going to see a black and white image, sort of like an alpha channel for the mask. Under there you can choose black and white and color. I don't know why they call it color, because as far as I can tell, all that does is turn the background black and make the subject some shade of gray. So not very useful. Now let me just show you real quickly a very useful tip. Because in Final Cut Pro, the mask area is shown in black, you might actually want that to be white. Some programs like After Effects, they'll render the alpha channel from, say, the Roto Brush, so that the subject is actually white. So one way you could accomplish that in Final Cut Pro is just add a solid white background underneath the masked clip, and then select the clip that's masked, and set its blend mode to stencil alpha. First you'll think nothing happened. But then make sure you click on View Mask so that it's not shown in this purple-blue color, but instead white, like so. And then also click on this upper body symbol, and there. At that point, you could just go to Share, Export File, and then you would end up with a black and white that corresponds to the mask. Anyway, nothing super important, just wanted to show you that. Okay, in the first part of the video, we just went over the magnetic mask interface, some of the nuances. Now we're going to actually get into assessing the performance. So I'm back at this clip and I found a frame that I think is going to make for a better first reference frame, and I've already gone ahead and done the fine tuning and everything. So that first reference frame is all set, and now I'm going to do the analysis. There are about 1,300 frames, so I'm going to fast forward through all this. Alright, we did the analysis, so a good thing to do is just do a scrub through the video and look how it went. In this case, we have some shadows that are picked up in the mask, but after that, it does a pretty good job of tracking the subject. Looks like it's doing a pretty good job of capturing the hair blowing in the wind, which is pretty impressive. So it's probably using some sort of edge refinement, similar to what Adobe After Effects Roto Brush does. A little bit of weirdness at the end with the stones being brought into the mask, but that'll be easy enough to fix up. So in general, I think he did a pretty good job. One thing we can do is view the mask itself. That gives us a better sense of what's going on at the edges, which is pretty important, obviously. So there has to be some work done on the feet. It looks like there's a little bit of edge noise in the legs and in the arms. But for the most part, I think it looks pretty good. Again, the hair is captured really well. But overall, not bad. It would be easy to clean up. And again, obviously in a real use scenario, you'd be doing more of an incremental approach. But in terms of establishing the baseline performance, I think it's pretty decent. It'd be nice if the edges were a little cleaner. And speaking of edges, if we zoom in, notice how the edges are smooth. So internally, it looks like the algorithm is applying some kind of edge softening, almost like a negative feathering amount. I think it would probably be better if there were more controls here in the mask so that you could actually have sharp edges if you wanted to, and then adjust the mask parameters later to control that kind of edge softening. But it looks like Apple wants to just give you that kind of result without your consent, which might not be a big deal. But for some of you, maybe that is a big deal. Anyway, now let's look at After Effects Roto Brush on the same clip. Now I'm going to do the same analysis that I did in Final Cut Pro in After Effects using the Roto Brush. So in After Effects, you're going to see Roto Brush having these default settings for the matte, feather at 5, contrast at 80, and we'll adjust those in a minute. The first thing you do in After Effects, just like you do in Final Cut Pro, is you create the initial mask. So here I am at the same exact frame that I was at in Final Cut Pro, and I've already created a mask. I'm not going to show you how I did that. This isn't a video on After Effects. And in addition to creating the mask, I've also used the Refine Edge tool, because in looking at the Final Cut Pro results, it looks like it's automatically doing that. That's why Final Cut Pro automatically does a pretty good job with hair. So I've done that so that here in After Effects, I have as close as possible to a baseline to compare with Final Cut Pro. And just like I hit the Analyze button in Final Cut Pro to do a one-click analysis, I'm going to do the same thing here in After Effects in the Roto Brush. So I'm going to click this Freeze button, and that's going to propagate the analysis forward, backwards, and I'll skip to the end. So I went ahead and did the analysis in Roto Brush, and it took about 7 minutes to freeze that, so quite a bit slower than Final Cut Pro's magnetic mask. Now the question is to take a look at the performance of each of these masks, look at the accuracy. Now, one thing you'll notice is right off the bat, we see with default settings, feather 5, contrast 80, that Adobe's trying to keep the edges intact, which is giving them this very rough, sawtooth kind of look. Compared to the result from the Final Cut Pro side, we can tell even when Final Cut Pro is showing no feathering, there definitely appears to be some kind of feathering applied automatically. And in the hair, you see that it's automatically applying some sort of edge refinement. So we can try to get a similar result in After Effects, and I find that if I set the feather to 10, contrast 25, then visually it's pretty similar. So this way I can make a better baseline comparison between Final Cut Pro magnetic mask and the Roto Brush in After Effects. And the result is fairly similar. Has some trouble at first with the shadows. But then when she stands up, does a pretty good job of the tracking. Also a good job of keeping those rocks out of the subject. In Final Cut Pro, you notice those rocks became part of the mask. Also, the edge refinement tool did a good job retaining the hair in the mask. One thing I do notice is sometimes there are these random holes that get added into the mask. Like here, I didn't notice that in Final Cut Pro. And we can further look at this in Final Cut Pro as I can export this as an alpha matte. The way you do that is choose a QuickTime movie, for instance, set the format to ProRes 422, channels alpha only, and I do straight unmatted. You'll end up with a black and white image that represents the alpha matte. Alright, so back here in Final Cut Pro, I did the equivalent analysis in After Effects with the Roto Brush, and I've imported that resulting clip into Final Cut Pro. So I've disabled that for now. Basically what I did was I imported the alpha mask. So in Final Cut Pro, like I said a moment ago, I noticed the edges don't seem to be very clean. There's a lot of noise. And I can compare it to the After Effects result by enabling this clip here. So now I can do frame by frame comparisons. Here we see the lines are much cleaner. I'll disable that so you see what's going on in Final Cut Pro. And by the way I have this showing up is the subject white. I'm just using the trick I showed you earlier in the video where I placed a solid white on the very bottom and then set the clip with the mask as stencil alpha blend mode. And then we can also look at sections where there are holes in the subject and see how they compare in those kind of situations. So right now we're looking at the Final Cut Pro result, and I'll switch to the After Effects result. So it looks a little crisper when those holes appear. And then let me talk about how they handle hair. Remember, in Final Cut Pro, it does a really good job automatically applying edge refinement to places like hair. In After Effects, you have to do a lot of work to do that kind of edge refinement. And in After Effects, you have to be extremely meticulous for applying the edge refinement as the subject is moving about, so it's incredibly time-consuming, actually. So after a lot of work in After Effects, I can get the hair looking pretty similar to how Final Cut Pro does it in one click. Remember in After Effects, we saw how it sometimes creates these random holes in the subject. It actually happens quite a bit in this clip. If we compare with Final Cut Pro, you don't have that effect. The subject where it should be solid is pretty much always staying solid, and that actually should be a pretty important criteria for a mask. But with After Effects, it falls kind of short there. Pretty easy to fix, but it would be nice if it didn't have that problem in the first place. So the bottom line, as you would expect, each method seems to have its pluses and minuses. But before I make a judgment based on one example, let me proceed and do an analysis of some of the other clips. I'm not going to go into this kind of detail, but real quick we'll see what's going on. Okay, the next clip is a cat entering a courtyard from behind a fence, walking a little bit and then jumping off. So Magnetic Mask has a little bit of trouble separating the cat from the fence, as you would expect. That'd be a pretty difficult problem to solve automatically. You'd want to do some manual touch-up there. But then from that point on, it does a really good job. And I want to look at this a little more carefully so you can see what Final Cut Pro is actually doing. So what I have here is the actual alpha mask that resulted. And we're going to zoom in. And notice that sometimes you have a fairly sharp edge, and other places you have what looks like the equivalent of After Effects Roto edge refinement. And this is where I think the Apple algorithm falls short, because with this kind of subject, obviously if you're using edge refinement in one spot of the fur, it wouldn't make sense to be excluding it in other places. And that's why when you scrub through the clip, there's a lot of edge noise. Because the algorithm is constantly adjusting how much edge refinement it's applying. And now compare that approach to After Effects, where you could use the Refine Edge tool any place where you see fit. So maybe around where there are whiskers, or if there's some frame where the subject is really soft out of focus, then you could go crazy and do edge refinement on the whole subject. And if you do that kind of edge enhancement of the whole subject, you can see you end up with a fairly noisy kind of image. Additionally, you could use feathering around the entire subject. That way you could globally soften things up. And I think that approach is obviously better than what's going on in Final Cut Pro, because this way you have total control of where it's going to be soft and how it's going to be soft. Whereas with Final Cut Pro, you kind of have to accept it's using some kind of algorithm where it's deciding for you where that edge refinement is going to happen. Anyway, I did the analysis of this clip in After Effects with the Roto Brush, and the result is pretty similar to what we saw in Final Cut Pro. First, there's a hard time distinguishing the cat from the fence, but then it does a good job thereafter until the moment when the cat leaps out of view, and some weirdness going on in the paws. But this could be easily fixed up afterwards to make for a cleaner mask. And then likewise, I'm going to go back into Final Cut Pro, save this as an alpha mask. And now looking at both masks in Final Cut Pro, you can get a sense for what's going on at the edges. So here is the Final Cut Pro version, again with that edge noise that I talked about. And then the same frame, that's the After Effects result. And so if I scrub through a little bit, you can see in After Effects, even though there's still edge movement, it's less noisy than the Final Cut Pro version. Let's look at another clip. Here we have the cat again behind an object. If the initial frame I started somewhere in the middle, it actually did a pretty good job of detecting the cat behind the table. Actually a really good job. And then it also does a good job keeping the tablecloth separate from the subject. And then it tracks the cat pretty well when it's running and leaping off. In this example, After Effects does not do a good job of detecting the cat from behind the table, whereas in Final Cut Pro it did an excellent job there. And then when the cat leaps off, it does a pretty good job, but some weirdness going on in some of the later frames. And then it kind of corrects itself. But the main thing is just noticing how well Final Cut Pro separated the cat from the table here at the beginning. And we'll go back to Final Cut Pro, look at the matte. Back here in Final Cut Pro, looking at the alpha matte exported from After Effects. With both masks in Final Cut Pro, a convenient way to compare them, apart from just looking at the mask itself, is to actually apply the mask. So I can just change the blend mode from normal to multiply, and then on the masked clip, just turn off the magnetic mask. So here we're viewing just the Final Cut Pro result, where it's not ideal, but obviously you do some fine tuning, some touch up. And now switching over to the After Effects mask. So that would require a lot of touch-up during the beginning and end frames. Now on to the next clip. With this one, I started the reference frame here at this point. And let's look at how that one went. So a pretty good job even before the cat leaps. A really good job just tracking the cat throughout these frames, throughout the camera movement, the cat movement. Even when the cat's blurry, does a pretty good job. And with this kind of clip, the edge noise in Final Cut Pro really wouldn't be noticeable. So with a lot less work compared to what you would have to do in After Effects, you would have a pretty decent result. And now in Adobe After Effects, using the same reference frame, a one-click solve. Obviously a tough time at first, tracking the cat there in the bushes, and then what we really care about is the cat in motion. It does a pretty good job. There, that leaf gets picked up. That could be fixed easily. And during some of the motion, the mask is becoming detached from the cat. So somewhat inconsistent tracking it. And at the end, obviously a tough job with the cat being out of focus. So in both cases, there'd be a lot of touch-up, but I just wanted to use a really extreme example, and the kinetic motion of this cat throughout this courtyard is a pretty good way to put these sorts of algorithms to a test. The next clip is my brother and I walking in the woods. This is a good example of using two subjects, and the challenges here are the foliage, as well as subjects crossing one another, as well as carrying an object that's in motion, in my case of a backpack. So it does an okay job. And there we cross, and it does a good job of keeping us separate. The mask is losing the feet quite often, which is to be expected given the challenge of the foliage on the ground. And then when the foliage comes in, the algorithm is having a hard time deciding when it wants the foliage to be in the mask versus out of the mask. And it's impressive that Apple is even trying to do this kind of detection, detecting the foliage in front of the subjects. Actually, in a good number of frames, they do a good job. But overall, a pretty decent result. Sometimes it's tracking the strap of the backpack, sometimes it's losing it. So obviously you would touch that up manually. Now on over to After Effects. A lot of challenges here, and it does a fairly good job, pretty similar to what we saw in Final Cut Pro. Though don't expect After Effects to do any sort of detection of the foliage in front of the subjects like Final Cut Pro was doing. Though in Final Cut Pro, notice when one subject moved across the other, it still retains which subject is which. Here in After Effects, you don't have that luxury. You would have to use layers and do separate masks. That's a plus in Final Cut Pro, its ability to do multiple subject masking. So here when they cross, they're getting treated as one subject, and then back to two. And then obviously at the end there'll be a lot of work dealing with the legs and the shrubbery. At the end it's not doing a good job maintaining the straps of the backpack. The main thing was to see how it handles the two subjects. Back to Final Cut Pro, where we can look at the masks from both algorithms, and here we're going to see Final Cut Pro's masking of the foliage in front of the subjects. Well, it does that successfully in some frames anyway. In this example, we see Final Cut Pro is having a hard time determining when to keep edges crisp versus applying edge refinement. Now I've switched over to the After Effects mask. The After Effects mask is staying relatively crisp along the edges, as you probably expect by now based on what we've analyzed previously. And obviously in the legs, a ton of work would have to be done. Next clip is a guitar player, who happens to be myself. And for me, having an algorithm work well with this kind of footage is really important, because I plan on shooting video footage of myself, not necessarily with a green screen, and then inserting myself into 3D environments. So with this one, I started the reference frame at the beginning. It does a pretty decent job. The main thing is to look at how the guitar itself is being handled, especially where the tuning pegs are. And it looks like there'll be some work needed there. That'll be more visible if we look at the mask. First, I'll jump over to After Effects. The main thing I was interested here was how well will it handle the contour of the guitar, especially the tuning pegs at the top of the neck. Does a pretty good job dealing with the holes in the subject. And some weirdness going on there at the tuning pegs. There would have to be some touch-up work, but the bottom line is it did a pretty good job overall. So just looking at the mask of the Final Cut Pro result, you can see that would require a lot of work, and some work where the hole is as well. Now comparing with the After Effects result, the headstock is considerably more stable, but there are places where it gets totally out of control. So there'd still be a lot of work needed there. But overall, a really good job. Okay, now that you've seen several examples of these masks in use, I think there are a couple of things we can say about each in terms of strengths and weaknesses. So first, about magnetic mask, its strengths. Obviously, it's very quick in its operation. It tracks fast subjects pretty well, even when they're blurry. And it does a good job of maintaining separation between a subject and a background, and it goes one step further and even tries to detect foliage in front of subjects. It can handle multiple subjects in one clip, which is pretty convenient. It tends to keep the overall integrity of a subject pretty well intact. You don't see these random holes being developed. And it also has a really good job with edge enhancement, so detecting hair and keeping hair looking pretty well detected throughout a clip, which also you'll see that edge refinement in Final Cut Pro is also at the same time a negative. Now on to After Effects Roto Brush and its strengths. It definitely has a very advanced user interface, which gives you a lot of control both prior to the analysis and post-analysis. It also has a very sophisticated edge refinement tool, which unlike the automatic edge refinement in Final Cut Pro, it's more of a manual tool that gives you the control. It can handle fast-moving subjects, but not quite as well as Final Cut Pro. It requires more touch-up work than Final Cut Pro would in terms of those contours. That said, when it does have contours well defined, they tend to be stable and crisp in comparison to the soft, noisier edges in Final Cut Pro. Obviously, we have to talk about weaknesses as well. So magnetic mask, the interface, as I mentioned before, definitely not very well thought of. Some improvement can be done there. The lack of parameters in the actual tool is kind of astonishing. I mean, thanks for giving us a feather control. I mean, I can understand that they're trying to use these large models for their artificial intelligence, and in order to do that and execute quickly, they need to give you as little parameters as possible. But I think for pro users, they're going to be kind of disappointed in that massive lack of control. And in terms of that feather setting, even when it's set to 0, it is not resulting in crisp edges. There is always some sort of edge refinement going on, which is making those edges soft. And when that refinement is going on, it tends to be varying quite a bit from frame to frame, from one part of the subject to the next. And that tends to be one of the reasons why you see a lot of edge, noise, and instability. Okay, now on to Adobe After Effects, the Roto Brush weaknesses. The execution time here is really problematic. I mean, we're talking several times slower than Final Cut Pro. So Adobe really has to get their act together, try using the GPU for certain calculations. Otherwise, I think people will start jumping ship to Final Cut Pro. Also, when a subject is in motion, especially when it's in pretty quick motion, the mask will lose that contour. I mean, obviously you would do touch-up work anyway, you would solve incrementally, but it would be nice if off the bat with the one-click solution, they'd already had those contours pretty well defined. And then sometimes you'll notice the mask itself losing integrity. So in places where you expect the subject to be completely masked, you'll see these holes appearing, so that's pretty problematic. And then finally, in After Effects, you don't have a very convenient way to handle multiple subjects like you saw in Final Cut Pro. You would have to use additional layers and do some other inconveniences. Not a big deal, but just something worth noting. So even though Final Cut Pro has a lot of strengths, I do have to say I think Roto Brush is the ultimate winner, especially when you look at its ability to keep clean, fairly noise-free edges, well, compared to Final Cut Pro. I mean, in Final Cut Pro, you'll be fine when you're just working with small devices, and Apple obviously is very fanatic when it comes to pushing small devices. And Magnetic Mask is going to be excellent for, TikTok videos and YouTube Shorts. But if you're doing more serious work, if you're doing filmmaking or any kind of work that requires more accuracy and precision, then despite the weaknesses of the Roto Brush, I think that's going to be your preference. Because the thing that's going to take up so much time in masking is maintaining stable edges. And right now, Magnetic Mask just can't compete with Roto Brush in terms of edge quality. But instead of just making that claim that Adobe After Effects has better edge stability and accuracy, I thought I would actually put this to a quantitative test. So what I've done is I've manually masked a couple seconds of myself playing the guitar in this clip, as well as very meticulously masking the guitar. And what this enables me to do then is for each frame that I've masked here, I can then compare to the generated frames from Magnetic Mask and Roto Brush, calculating those differences frame by frame, and that'll give me a sense of the error in each algorithm. And the way I did that was just with a very basic script that I wrote in Python. So the Python script is pretty simple. You read in a mask corresponding to either Final Cut Pro or After Effects, and then you read in a reference mask, specify a start and an end frame, set up some arrays, then you loop through all the frames for a given frame, compute the difference at that frame between the reference mask and the masking algorithm's mask, compute a difference between those two, square those differences, sum them, and then at the very end you end up with an array of all the differences, and then just take the average of that, and that gives you a good sense for overall how similar the reference mask is to the mask outputted from some algorithm. And just to give you a sense visually what that all means, on the left, this is the difference image between the reference mask at some given frame and for that same frame what the Final Cut Pro mask looked like. And where you see in white, that's where you're seeing the differences. And likewise on the right, this is that same frame with the difference computed between the reference mask and the mask generated from After Effects. And you can see, and maybe depending on the size of your monitor, it might be a little subtle, but the After Effects mask has less difference compared to the reference mask, which is just a visual way of seeing that the After Effects mask seems to be a bit more accurate. And one other thing we can do to try to quantify the difference between these algorithms is look at the edge stability. So I talked a lot about the edges in this video. So here I am at one frame in the first clip, and if you go from one frame to the next, obviously there's going to be change. But even still, as you go from one frame to the next, you expect a certain number of pixels to stay fairly consistent because the edges aren't moving all over the place, they're moving gradually. Okay, with fast-moving subjects, obviously edges aren't moving so gradually. And if we compare one frame to a previous frame, we can see what that difference looks like visually. And that's what I'm showing here. So shown in white are pixels that have changed. And if there's a lot of edge movement, you would expect to see a lot of change in this difference image. And I wrote a separate but similar Python script to measure this sort of edge movement difference. The difference being, instead of looking at one frame, comparing a reference mask to an algorithms mask, I'm just looking at one given mask from either Final Cut Pro or After Effects, looking at some frame, and then just taking a difference, squaring a difference, and then computing an RMS basically. The end being just one single number that gives a sense for, in general, how much were the pixels moving around. And after I've gone ahead and done that kind of analysis, here are all the results. So in blue, you're seeing the Final Cut Pro magnetic mask figures, and then in red, Adobe After Effects Roto Brush. And consistently, the Final Cut Pro magnetic mask has higher edge movement. That's what these larger blue columns represent. So sometimes you're talking about a difference of 10% or so, other times 30 or more, 20 or so. Overall, the average is about 20%. So that's telling us that over thousands of frames in these various clips, that in general, Final Cut Pro does indeed exhibit greater edge instability. So what we saw visually is backed up by what we're seeing quantitatively in the calculations. And then likewise with the reference mask, and here I've just normalized because the reference mask calculation isn't the same as when we were looking at frame-to-frame differences in one mask. So with the reference mask calculation, we also see that Final Cut Pro's magnetic mask was differing from the reference mask by around 25%. So that's a pretty big difference, especially considering that this particular reference clip of me playing the guitar, there wasn't an extreme amount of movement, but still in that case, quite a bit of deviation from the actual reference mask. And together, these two types of analyses, they basically confirm what I was seeing in the results, which is Roto Brush is better with edge stability, and overall, except for very fast-moving subjects, in general, its masking is more accurate. So I hope you enjoyed, and that now you have a better understanding of which of these tools might be better for you.